But I think the thing that would be really scary about Shirley is the way she transformed when she drank. So, there's the whole her being sharp with Jada and being like, don't look at the doors, this isn't your house, get your little grubby fingers out of here. There's that side. But then there's another side that is decidedly crazy. And not just mean and not just, some people get mean and then some people get emotional and some people get huggy. But she was like all those things and then some. Hey, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and we are on another episode of Worthy. This is chapter 2, The Blessed Child of Two Addicts. And, I just want to say before we even get into this that Jada Pinkett Smith has done some wonky, crazy, weirdo stuff with her pain as an adult. I think we can all agree that some of the stuff that she's done later in life mystifies all of us to the extreme. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that something about her childhood really, really messed her up. And I don't know how much of this chapter is the God's honest truth and how much of it is her retelling her story to fit her present narrative. I don't know. What I do know is that both of her parents were addicts. I know that her dad's parents were very strange. At least her paternal grandmother was a real dose. But I think that when it comes to these early chapters, when there is a lot that's happening to her as a child, I have less of a desire to really go hard on the idea of little Jada. I said the same thing when I reviewed Spare with Harry. When it came to him talking about his mother and his mother's death and how he was shattered, his recollection of that is that there was nobody there for him. In reality, there were people there for him. But the way he felt was so depressed and upset about it that he couldn't feel the nearness of others. So in his recollection, there wasn't anybody around. Is that true? Is that a true way to retell the story? No. But it did shape and mold his life so that he has a real problem, and he has real problems stemming from the incident of his mother's death. So even though I know that as an adult he went weird places with his pain, I still want to show empathy to the little one, to the little Harry that happened to, knowing that he was not fully equipped. He didn't have an adult mind to handle a huge tragedy. I feel the same way with Jada. Okay, so she's going to go weird and wild places with her pain later on in life. But there was something that happened to her early on in her childhood that would have created the need to constantly be looking for adoration from others, constantly be needing to be seen by others, wilding out in a desperate attempt to be loved. Those are choices that she makes as an adult, but she didn't make the choices to have a abusive couple of parents. She didn't make the choice to be unloved and abandoned by people who should have really cared about her. And what also becomes startlingly evident in this chapter is that really beautiful picture she painted with her grandmother Maran was an inconsistent reality. So it seems like her mom kept coming up with money so that they could move out to another apartment. Then she couldn't come up with rent, so they'd have to come back. So while it seemed like in the last chapter it was this big block of time when she was with Maran, that doesn't appear to actually have been true. It seems like she was trying to describe in the last chapter how Maran was the key influencer in her life. And I think it's very, very interesting that if you're going to write about your life, the people that you write about, who are the person that you write about who is the biggest influence on you isn't your mother. It's some other lady, and it is a grandmother, but she almost brushes Adrien aside in that first chapter we read as just another person in her life. And that is certainly highlighted in this chapter. We're going to talk about her mother. We're going to talk about her father. We're going to talk about her paternal grandparents, especially her paternal grandmother. And so there's a lot that I have to say in this chapter about the people around Jada. I'm not yet invested in the idea that Jada herself at this point in her story needs to be hammered inexhaustibly because she's like a little kid, right? So my focus right now is going to be on the adults in this story who clearly were not holding up their end of the bargain. And she's not overly negative about them either. She's stating facts without giving us a lot of interpretation of those facts, which I really appreciate, because that gives us the ability to sift through this narrative and sort of sort through what might or might not be so. So this was a really interesting chapter and much more promising than that prologue had ever suggested this book might be. In fact, she makes several points where I put an exclamation point and actually wrote, "That's an awesome point." So I was pleasantly surprised by some of the things I read in this chapter. And, I'm never going to say that this book is going to win some kind of Pulitzer Prize because it's just such searingly good writing, but it's way more interesting than I thought it was going to be. So let's get into it. As always, like, comment, subscribe, share with a friend, all that jazz. You know how to do. So she starts out and says, "When you gain the courage to go prowling within the murky memories of the past, you may choose to follow muddy footprints back to your origins. Those footprints can turn into either lotus leaves or pools of quicksand." All right, so it's like, So she starts by saying, "I'm standing in the spacious converted attic living area that I share with my mother at her parents' house. In this early memory, I am patiently waiting at Adrien's side. She's in her early 20s at the time, so I'm likely about 5 or 6 years old. I watch intently as she stands looking into the mirror, putting on her makeup to go out for the night. In the attic, when it's just me and my mother, it's our safe little world attached to the bigger safe world of my grandparents' home, and watching my mother study her reflection in the mirror while putting on lipstick always intrigues me." As a side note, there's a long description about this attic. It's not like some little hole in the wall up there. It's a huge converted attic. There's like 3 bedrooms, a long hallway, very cozy. So it's not like she was just stashed away up in some attic like Cinderella or something. Anyway, whenever she's with her mother up there, it's just a safe little world, but her mother is decidedly her older sister. There can't be any other way to describe this relationship. Even she describes it this way. She continues, she says, "After applying very little makeup, my mother lights up. Her eyes shine a little brighter. All she needs now are high heels and a night on the town dress, and bam, she's ready to make the scene. Of course, I have all kinds of questions. Where are you going, Mommy?" "I'm going to Gatsby's. It's a club," she mumbles through puckered lips as she fixes her lipstick. "Ooh," I think. "Are you going with Aunt Jackie?" She's Adrien's best friend and my godmother. Adrien brushes her eyelashes with mascara and answers with a smile, "Yep." "What are y'all going to be doing?" Now that's grown folks' business. This answer, spoken with a tinge of impatience, is classic. But since I'm always hanging with her and the girlfriends, I'm used to being in grown folks' business, and I love kicking it with the big kids. Like an older sister, though, Adrien is quick to remind me to stay in a child's place. You know how big sisters let little sisters be part of the mix with their friends for a while, and then quickly change their mind and need the younger siblings to stay in their lane? That's me and Mommy. So it's a strange dynamic, not one that is all that surprising, given the fact that she is living with her grandmother, and her grandmother has really taken over the mothering role. So how else was she supposed to relate to her mother? As anything other than the big sister. That's exactly the dynamic that has been created. There is the matriarch, and then this other person is just someone you hang out with, and somebody who can tell you what to do from time to time if it enters into her pretty little head to do so. But other than that, how else could she have related to her mother? She says, "This memory repeats in other settings. There were stretches when Adrien was able to save up enough to get us our own place to live. Those stints didn't last long. Once we were even evicted after she came up short on the rent. Whatever the situations were, we were blessed to be able to move back in with Marian and Gilbert. If there was any criticism from them, I didn't hear it. Instead, they encouraged Mommy to think about her career. Her father approved of her interest to become a doctor, but he told her to embrace the nursing field. Grandfather felt that because she was a young mother, the rigors of medical school would prohibit her from spending quality time with me." I think that was really grandfather trying to help her remember that she had a kid, because it just seems like she was totally okay with the parents handling the mothering and fathering of this child. Adrien seems like she spent a lot of time just going out and doing her own thing. And it just seems like when it comes to Jada, her mom seems very cold and not very maternal. It doesn't seem like she was looking to cultivate a mother relationship with Jada. And we'll see that throughout the book. Now, Jada is not pressing that on us. She's not saying, "My mom never cared about me." I mean, there's like one line in the end of this chapter that suggests that she felt like there was always distance between her mother and her. But how could there not have been? When the mother is not looking to cultivate a maternal relationship, so it's not Jada's fault that she felt like her mom wasn't that into her, because it's really evident throughout all the mother's behavior that she's really not into the fact that she's got a kid. It's just really cramping her good time. Also, it's interesting that this time with the grandparents wasn't one linear block of time like I had felt in the beginning chapter. And after we read the entirety of this chapter, it's totally making more sense to me why she was wandering the streets to go see her boyfriend in the middle of the night who worked over at 7-Eleven. There's times in her life when she lived in safety with her grandparents. That is not one block of time. It's not like it was such a bridge to cross to be wandering the streets at night over to the 7-Eleven, like it had originally seemed from the first chapter. All right. Interestingly, she says that whenever I watched my mother getting ready for the night, the prospect of Adrien going out to have a good time with her friends didn't register as my mother leaving to have a fun time without me. On the contrary, her smile made me feel that the future held those possibilities for me as well. As in, oh, I can't wait till the day comes when I'm old enough to put on makeup and go out like mommy. And, quite frankly, it's probably because her mother leaving wasn't like her safe place leaving the house. It's not like, oh, my person's leaving, That's why kids are so upset when their parents leave, because that's their safety walking right out the door, and without me, But it's not, I've had a tendency to feel that when grandmother was maybe getting ready to go out, if grandmother ever got ready to go out, and she did, she was like a socialite. I'll bet you anything Jada felt differently about that experience than seeing her mom go out. It's just her older sister, Someday that'll be me, like every little sister thinks when they see their big sister get ready to go to an event or something like that. But Jada says that in the years to come, these nights out took a definite turn. As I got older, I began to suspect that things were made to appear to be normal and okay, in fact, when they were not. Those promising moments spent watching my mother in the mirror all dressed up would fade, replaced by more complicated scenes. We both became masters at keeping up appearances. That's where the lotus leaves end and the quicksand begins. I don't really get this whole lotus leaf quicksand analogy. It's just clunky, but whatever. She doesn't keep using it, so there's that. So now we're going to go back to the very beginning. The story between Jada's mother and her dad, Robsol. And she says, here's what I knew as a child. I was not planned. My parents, Adrien Banfield and Robsol Pinkett, met in high school. After my mother became pregnant at age 17, the two were married a short time later. Adrien gave me the name Jada, which was the name of her favorite actress, Jada Rowland. Now, it's spelled the same, but not pronounced the same. Jada Rowland was a actress in a soap opera called The Secret Storm. You might say that my mother's decision to name me after an actress could have been either prophetic or wishful thinking. In any case, I couldn't have asked for a better name that was almost exclusively mine. My middle name came about a little differently. For that, Adrien decided to pay tribute to her sister, Karen, but changed the A to an O so that I have my own special version, Corin. When I was a kid, if I was pushing the envelope or in trouble, fighting in school, acting out, I'd blame my alter ego, Corin. Later, it became a running joke with me and my friends that if Corin surfaced, everybody better take cover. Was Corin the one running that red table? I don't know, she legit seems like she does have an alter ego. The chronicle of how I became to be the, quote, blessed daughter of two addicts was not a tale told for my or anyone else's consumption. Not for decades, at least. Can we just pause real quick? What is the paperback dime store novel title that she's so impressed that she's come up with? The Blessed Child of Two Addicts. That's so stupid. Why do you keep saying that? That's the title. You've said it again. What are you talking about? She never really explains it. As a child, I was not aware of the tumultuous relationship and traumatic events that had taken place between my parents, incidents that were full of physical and emotional abuse. Well, she might not have been actually aware that there was something going on that was wrong between the parents. I mean, they probably weren't. All evidence would suggest that in her childhood, no one was brawling on the living room floor in front of her, but you don't need people to be throwing things and screaming for you to feel the tension in the house when you're a kid, And it would almost be a relief if you saw people fighting and brawling, because at least you could place why it feels so bad around here, She says that upon hearing that Adrien was pregnant, my grandmother pulled from her own trauma and addressed the situation by doing for her daughter what no one had done for her. Marion confronted Robsol Pinkett and gave him three choices. You can marry Adrien, we can pay for an abortion, or you can put this child up for adoption. What was never on the table was Adrien can have this baby and be a single mom, and we're just going to be okay with it. That was like not even an option, because they weren't about to let their daughter wander through the world with that kind of, badge of shame. So, hey, Robsol, you're going to marry her, we're going to abort this kid, or you're going to put it up for adoption. Those are the options. And in a really remarkable passage, and, I just felt like it was such a great point on Jada's part. She says, when I eventually heard how Robsol gave a resounding yes, I will marry her, despite his parents' stance that he didn't have to do anything he didn't want to do, it made me realize, wow, that was a life-saving decision for me, and the stand-up thing for him to do. His one action gave my life an anchor in this world, yet also sent a message to Adrien that she would have been of less value as an unwed young mother. I understand why her parents were worried for her going through the world with the stigma of being an unwed mother. It's really, really hard to be a single parent, and eventually, like less than 1 year later, she became what they didn't want her to be, an unwed young mother, But it is a really good point that they essentially told Adrien that if you bring this child into the world, you are of less value unless there's a man attached to your scenario. Obviously, you would want the child to be raised in a home with two loving parents. But two wrongs don't make a right. If you find that you're pregnant because you weren't watching out, then don't compound the problem by bringing that child into a home with a parent that doesn't really want to be there, feels manipulated into being there, or maybe wants to be there in like the idea of being there. He knows that's the right thing, but he is incapable of actually being a good dad. And this guy sounds like a rather flimsy character. So I don't even know why her parents were pushing on her, hey, you better get married to this guy, or we abort the baby, or you give him up. But never have the baby and we'll take care of the baby and we'll help you out. No need to hitch your star to his wagon. We'll just help you bring this new life into the world. And it bothers me that they would even suggest, let's abort our grandbaby. That bothers me. And, thank God that Robsol might have been a flimsy character, but at least he wasn't willing that should happen, And it was a life-saving decision that he did that. And it is a great point. She should never have been made to feel that bringing that child into the world on her own diminished her value. Certainly did not, So, good point, Jada, I must say. She goes on to give grace for why grandmother would have suggested that Adrien couldn't be an unwed mother, because this was a message grandmother had already suffered. The need to be perceived a certain way in the world was a trauma response for my grandmother and unintentionally passed on to her daughters. My mother revered her mother, and yet I wonder if it became too much over the years to live up to Marian's standards. I wonder if this burden damaged my mother's sense of self-worth over time. Probably. But, how much can we pin on other people, and how much do we just have to take responsibility for the way we interact with the world? I mean, Adrien could for the whole rest of her life say, it's my mother's fault, I never felt like I could live up. Marian has never been a seemingly vicious person or an unkind person. I think she saw for her daughter the same situation that she'd known for herself when she was 13 years old and found herself pregnant, and just wanted to make it all go away for Adrien if possible. Also, grandmother had given birth to a child and put it up for adoption and then had gone on to live her life. So in her mind, keeping the child around, and specifically if Adrien was going to be unwed, was just a recipe for disaster. So, just let's not go down that road. But I think that at a certain point, Adrien and Jada can't always say, well, it was grandmother's fault because of the culture in her home made it feel like this was a standard and we couldn't deviate from it. I'm not saying it didn't play any part in what the kind of decisions that Adrien made out throughout her life, or the fear that her parents would be disappointed in her. But also we continue to get the narrative that the grandparents were very understanding, very open-minded, very much opened their house to her daughters, very open about all things, conversations could be had. It doesn't seem like it was a real closed society in that house where, these are the moral guidelines, and if you don't do these things, then we're ashamed of you, and we don't hardly know how to function with you as a family member. That doesn't really seem like that's the kind of house they had. So it seems like we might be sort of reverse engineering how we got to the point we're at by going back and saying, well, it's probably Marian standards. Marian standards? What standards did Marian have? And what moral standards was she hammering on about? She wasn't a religious person, and it just doesn't seem like she was the sort of person that was going to beat anybody over the head with some kind of rigid morality. I don't know. But she was a product of her own time, so it probably was just an embarrassment to think of her daughter being in a bad situation. She was just trying to figure it out. Back on to Rob. Rob's erratic behavior could only have compounded her lack of self-esteem. Well, it's not Rob's fault that she's got bad self-esteem problems. Okay, are we going to turn to the mother and just be like, okay, the mother's making bad choices. It's not grandmother's fault. It's not Rob's fault. Do they play a part in the way she perceives herself? Of course, everybody that we have interaction with is going to, if we allow them, play some part in how we see ourselves. But at a certain point, you have to just decide that my world is not made or broken by the opinion of other people, and I have to be responsible for my own choices. All right, but now it's Rob's fault that she's got bad self-esteem. Now, I will say Rob is an abusive monster, so I'm not giving Rob a pass at all. I'm just saying, let's all be responsible for ourselves, shall we? So it would appear that Rob had an escalating problem with alcohol and drug addiction, and he could lurch into a level of violence that was terrifying and confusing. The abuse was throughout their entire relationship, but it also included when she was pregnant. After she'd had the baby, one day at her parents' house, shortly after Jada was born, an argument got out of hand. She writes, "My grandparents weren't home at the time, and my mother put me on the floor to keep me safe from Rob in a violent rage, and he backed her into another room and punched her in the stomach. In fear for her life, Adrien distracted him by saying, 'Rob, we left the baby in the other room,' and as he turned to come get me, she ran across the street to a neighbor's house." Friends, does any of that make sense to you? I have 3 kids. If somebody was being physically erratic, I would not respond to that by putting the newborn on the floor where it might get stepped on. That doesn't make any sense. And then, this is what I'm saying, where she showed no maternal instincts. What mother places the baby on a floor and then runs out of the house when there's a violent person in the house? Runs to the neighbor, saves her own life, and doesn't save the baby? Whose play is to just leave the baby on the floor in another room and then tell the violent offender, "Oh, go get the baby"? She claims that she did that because she was never worried that Rob was ever going to hurt the baby. And throughout the chapter, Jada backs that mentality up. My dad never hurt me. My dad never hurt me. He never laid a hand on me. My mom was right to trust my dad. And I say to you, well, maybe he never physically hurt you, but he was 100% okay with punching your mom in the stomach. And by not regarding your mother, he was hurting you. What if something had happened to your mom? Right? And that would have been at his hands. He doesn't regard your life enough that he would want to shepherd and take care of and look after the person who gave you life. So I'm sorry, your dad might not have physically hurt you, but he was totally fine with hurting the people that mattered to you. This is just not enough to say, well, my dad never was going to hurt me. But it's an odd story. That's a really weird story to me. And it's just not one that makes sense. And I feel like she's not coming to the right conclusions about that story, being like, my mom loved me so much that she just did all she could. And, she ran out of that house, and, what a hard choice for her to have to make, to leave me on the floor, and try to go get help. I mean, I don't know if it's a hard choice. It's an odd choice. It's a weird choice. It's a very unmaternal choice. Okay, she says that it was heartbreaking to hear about how her mother had to leave her on the floor in a house and escape his assault. And again, like I already said, she was certain that Jada would be safe because she says, "I knew that your father was never going to hurt you, Jada." Okay, I mean, I feel like her mom just is way too okay with this dad in Jada's life. Now, I am not one of those people that's like, oh, well, if the marriage is over, if the relationship is over, there needs to be bitter feud between the parents. Hardly. People need to get along for the children's sake. So I'm not saying that there shouldn't have been, yes, make sure that the child is in in contact with his biological father. If the father wants to be in contact with the child, yes, foster that relationship the best you can. But the dad has proven himself to be violent, a drug addict, and an alcoholic. And yet, whenever Jada has a chance to see him, the mother takes no action to make sure that these are supervised visits if she can't be around. Now, the grandparents in all the situation were like available and on it and always there if Jada was going to spend time with her dad. But Adrien never bothered to think that it would be important. And the only thing I can think is that because she felt burdened by having to raise the child on her own. Maybe she wanted Rob to experience what that was really like. So she didn't care if he had her on his own because, yeah, you need to know how hard it has been for me. So I'm not going to arrange help to be right around the corner for you. You need to know how it really is to have your daughter, So maybe that's why she didn't take steps or actions to provide some kind of supervised visitation. Regardless, everybody else in the picture was like, yeah, Rob doesn't see her alone. Jada continues, my mother believed that Rob would never lay a hand on me and that he had the right to exercise his desire to be a father on the few occasions that he chose to do so. She describes her father as a stonemason by trade, highly skilled, extremely handsome and brilliant. He was esoteric, and by this I mean multidimensional in unexpected ways. Apparently he liked to come up with poetry. There's a poem he wrote later on in this chapter. I can't really make heads or tails of it, but maybe you guys will get it. She says he was eclectic in his interests, colorful in his taste and style, and occasionally really out there. And now we come for another example of the classic Jada Pinkett Smith build up and let down. So she's going to go on and on and on about her dad just did something wild, something crazy, you never could have guessed. And then what the end result is, it's like, that's not that weird. In fact, pretty nice little situation there. She says that an example of him being like really out there was when I was 7 or 8, he sent me a birthday present that had everyone scratching their head. This one was so wild. It's like, what was Rob thinking? Huh? What's going on? She says that at first glance, it appeared that he had shipped me a family of brass elephants. They turned out to be brass bells made as different-sized elephants. For someone like me, who later became curious about Eastern mysticism and culture, the choice wasn't so far off the mark. At the time, I don't know what had made Rob think that brass elephant bells would ring for a child, but that was the beauty of my father. Okay. That is not, why was everyone scratching their heads over this? What did they think he was going to get her? I mean, I think that's a really cool gift, honestly. And I have to say that if I was an 8-year-old, I would have treasured those brass elephants. I mean, how cool. A graduated size of elephants and they're all bells and they all ring. I mean, imagine the joy as a child, the enchanting joy of having those brass elephants up on a shelf. Maybe your parents kept them on a shelf and would let you play with them from time to time. And they would bring them down. It would be really exciting. You'd, arrange them on the coffee table. And I think it's a charming gift. And I think it's a sort of gift that as a kid, you would just be enchanted by. So I don't understand why why is she acting like it was just so wild and crazy? That's Jada for you. Just, building you up. I just see, what's it going to be? And then it's like nothing. Okay, she says that one thing I valued early on was how Rob was always in search of new thought, new answers, always right on the cutting edge of something, whether it was exploring alternate realities or sacred geometry. For someone who was often under the influence of drugs and alcohol, he rarely appeared to be inebriated when he was with me. Oh, well, that's good. But I also think it's less charming that he was over here exploring alternate realities and sacred geometry when all this whimsy came from the fact that he was probably high as a damn kite. She says, I do remember my father held a look of sadness in his eyes, a glimpse that he was carrying a great weight. He did have a beautiful smile and a beautiful laugh. I don't know what haunted Rob, I just knew that it was there. Now, she says that she never did pick up on this violent streak that she'd heard tell of. Although, one time she was with her mother and her mother was dressing out for the evening and she saw a cut on her mother's lower back. It wasn't like a new fresh cut or anything like that, but it was a scar. She asked her mother what had happened and her mom said, just completely matter-of-factly, oh, well, my father pushed me over the balcony when he was drunk. She says the statement was matter-of-fact, nonchalant, and she didn't go any further. I got the sense that while she wasn't going to lie, there was nothing more that she was going to tell me in that moment. And, then she goes on to say that what I've already mentioned is that whenever she was with her dad, regardless of the fact that this guy had an extremely abusive history and the family knew about it, to such an extent that the mother had to divorce him over it, Adrien never saw any reason to supervise the visits when the dad came around. So grandparents did. And that is what gets us into the discussion of his parents and what sort of people they were. Because apparently Jada was spending a lot of time with them as well. It is not the same little cozy nest of safety and security over there as it is with Adrien's parents. Now, they're in a different financial bracket, but that has nothing to do with safety. So hear me when I say this. I'm not saying that things are not as good over at Rob's family because they aren't as affluent. That's got nothing to do with it. The grandfather is a charming man, and he seems, steady as a rock. It's the grandmother we have to look out for, Grandmother Shirley. So she goes to talk about what it was like over there. She says, unlike the predominantly white and Hasidic neighborhoods where I lived with my mother's parents, my father's parents' neighborhood, about 20 minutes away, was much more blue-collar and made up almost exclusively of black folks. If I was at the band fields and I went out on my own, on foot or on my bike, walking to cross-country elementary school, for example, I was often the only black person on the street. The opposite was true in the neighborhood where I spent time visiting my father's parents. I loved the neighborhood where Shirley and Grant lived. That's Rob's parents. Everything about it made me feel at home. I loved how everybody knew everybody's name and knew everybody else's kids' names and looked out for one another. The community was family. We were all a tribe. She says that 7 houses up from the Pinketts was the home of Mommy Bobby. She was like a magical character from a storybook, very pale. She could have passed for white. She had big black hair done in a dramatic bouffant. She always wore polyester pants and had a variety of 1970s necklaces with medallions and wore glasses with big black frames. Mommy Bobby loved children and owned a wonderful nursery school close by, which I attended at 3 years old after Grandmother Shirley recommended it to my mother. So Grandmother Shirley got her into this school with Mommy Bobby, and at this place they had all sorts of little productions and things like that, and that's where Jada wants you to know that this is where she really saw her true calling as an actress, back when she was 3 at Mommy Bobby's nursery school. She says that she got the coveted part of The Wicked Witch of the West in their production of The Wizard of Oz, and she ran down the aisle of a borrowed auditorium, her face smeared with green paint, delightedly speaking up my lines at the top of my lungs, screaming, "I'm the Wicked Witch of the West! I'm the Wicked Witch of the West!" Adults began to applaud for me as Mommy Bobby loudly, proudly joined in. That was it. The bug hit me young. Mommy Bobby became like a third grandmother to me. She would always say to my mother, "That child is something. Watch out, world." Oh, prophetic. Okay, well, she says that whenever she was over at her grandparents' house, her paternal grandparents' house, she had a complicated relationship with her grandmother, Grandmother Shirley, she calls her. And Shirley had her ways, and they were never to be questioned. Shirley sounds like the sort of person you would really have to navigate carefully around. She seems like she could have gone off at any moment. A real loaded gun, this one. She said that after Shirley had taught me to play solitaire, I decided to test the format. Why pick up 3 cards at a time from the deck to see if you got a card that you needed? It was more efficient to pick up cards one by one. Grandmother Shirley stood over me and very clearly stated, "That's not how you play that game." If I was playing on my own, who would it hurt if I changed a rule? No. Shirley was real about rules, especially with games. There was one way to do everything, and it was her way. A rule was a rule. When we played Boggle, as soon as that saying went through the hourglass, it was pencils down. My grandmother Shirley was charming, but biting. A walking paradox. She had been a school principal at one point, and she loved books, and she loved learning, and she really put a lot of importance on education, and both she and her husband, Grant, were voracious readers. She says, my fondest memories of Grandmother Shirley take me back to her small, narrow kitchen around a small table that fit all 3 people in total. She had a tiny TV in there, which was on 24/7. She was either watching the news, her favorite game show, or any one of her preferred soap operas. So her fondest memory is of her grandmother in the kitchen watching TV. That should tell you all we need to know about Grandmother Shirley, but she'll go on. She says that Grandmother Shirley could really throw down on some chicken. Whenever she baked her delicious salt and pepper chicken wings, Jada says, I had the opportunity to witness my grandmother clean that meat off the bone like no other. She was not shy about cracking that bone open and sucking out the marrow. If she caught me staring, she would exaggerate the sucking sounds and attack those bones as if she hadn't eaten in a whole year. I'd crack up laughing. She'd smile back at me. We never acknowledged the humor of it at all, which made it even more cool. It was our thing. Shirley Holland Pinkett was a beautiful woman as well. Okay. Here, Jada decides to give herself a little compliment, and also, I can't exactly see what she's talking about. Shirley Holland Pinkett was a beautiful woman as well, with a lovely smile and a subtle magnetism. Some of my features come from Shirley. Way to compliment yourself, Jada. She says that her square jaw and deep dimple in her chin come from Shirley, but I get the jaw thing because Jada has a very defined jaw, but what is this dimple in her chin? Have you ever seen Jada with a deep dimple in her chin? I don't ever recall seeing any pictures like that with Jada. Regardless, who cares? Let's get into how Shirley really was. Shirley was a homebody. She hadn't always been this way, but the older she got, the more of a recluse she became. Jada says that as she got older, Shirley became more and more resistant to going out. My grandfather Grant did all the shopping for her clothes, the food, and all the necessities of the household. But the crazy part was that when Shirley did decide to leave the house, she dressed to kill, in furs and fine jewelry and a snappy, stylish ensemble. Lady's insane. She says she takes a few words to explain what Grandfather Grant was like. He was a man of few words, even fewer words than her maternal grandfather, and he had hardly anything to say for himself. But what she loved about Grandfather Grant was that he would always take her on errands with him, and he loved her fiercely. And one of the ways that shows that he loved her is he was always taking pictures of her. She was his little pride and joy, and he just toted her everywhere, loved on her. He wasn't a very verbose man, but she knew beyond a shadow of doubt that he would protect her. And interestingly, it was always Grandfather Grant and her mother's mother, Maran, who would show up for her when parents were supposed to show up. So at any school events or anything like that, it was always Grandfather Grant and Grandmother Maran, a representative for both sides of her parentage, but never her actual parents. She tells a story about how one December when she was 6, her grandfather asked, Christmas is coming, what do you want? And she said she wanted the Baby Alive doll, but they only came as white dolls and her mother wouldn't let her have a white doll. That's crazy racist. Imagine if a white mother said, you can't have that black doll. We don't do black dolls in this house. Yeesh. Like, what are you talking about? In the same way, for her mother to be like, you can't have that doll you really want because it's a white doll. Lady, what? I'm not here for that. But grandfather's like, I bet we could find us a black doll. So they get in the car and they start driving around. They look and look and look and they can't find one. But lo and behold, come Christmas Day, he's found the black baby doll. And somehow he located it. And that was the kind of guy he was. He always went the extra mile. She says the Pinkett's house was a typical working-class multi-level row house with the usual first floor and second story, plus a bonus floor on the basement level that my grandparents eventually turned into a separate living area. Whenever Rob was allowed to be around, the basement was where he slept. Now, this is one of the most excruciating stories I've ever heard, so hang tight, because it's just so emotionally disturbing for everybody involved. For everybody involved. And, we can say, Jada lies about all things. But I am fairly certain that something along this lines would have played out. And it had to have played out if her dad was this big of an addict. And it's been documented that he was. She says, I have only vague memories of visiting with my father in my early years. For instance, one instance that stands out vividly was at a point when he was deep in his addiction. And he came by, but was not allowed in the house. Drunk, high, probably both. He banged on the front door begging, Ma, let me in. I'm hungry. I need a place to stay. Can you imagine if that was you you're at the table, you've got your little grandbaby, and your son is banging at the door begging you to let him in. And you can't because he's just in a state and you've got this grandbaby to protect. But that's your flesh and blood standing out on the doorstep begging you to let him in, saying he's hungry, like, oh, no. That's so hard to hear. From the kitchen where I sat at the table, I could see Shirley in the entryway calling through the front door. Rob, you got to get yourself together. You know you can't stay here. He pleaded with her. I could feel his desperation even if I couldn't make out all his words. She pressed against the door and the two continued to go back and forth in an exchange that seemed to soften her. She returned to the kitchen and took food from the fridge, placed some of it in sandwich bags, and then went back to the front door. I watched as she opened the door barely enough to drop a paper bag on the porch. Then she shut it and returned to her seat at the kitchen table, muttering, "Well, at least I'll have something to eat." And then she looked down at her game of solitaire and picked up where she had left off. I don't care what anybody says. My heart goes out so much to every person in that scenario, and that would be such a sad memory for you as a kid. I mean, on the one hand, her dad is not somebody that she knows, so this isn't necessarily like, the dad that you'd always loved has suddenly become this raging addict, and the man that you once knew and loved is standing outside like a stranger begging for food, and you are trying to reconcile in your mind who you once knew with who he has become. But doesn't matter. Like, she knew intellectually that man on the doorstep is my dad, even if she hadn't had a good relationship at this point, in the sense that, not that the dad had beaten her or anything like that, but he's just not around, so she hasn't developed that connection with him. But it would still just be so hard to see that. And then later on, thinking about that as you became an adult and you really pondered the feelings of everybody in that scenario, it would make that memory even more painful to think of. She goes on to say that my father and his mother had an excruciatingly unbreakable bond. My father at his core was a mama's boy. He would tell me later that there was no one he loved more, but their dynamic was complicated. Complicated is Jada Pinkett Smith's word for crazy as hell. She constantly talks about this was complicated, that was complicated. All right, already, spell it out, right? And stop all of this talk about how, well, let's sit and ponder and, give everybody a wide berth of understanding. No, Grandmother Shirley, she goes on to say, freaking nuts. The dad's an addict, the mother is nuts. I mean, complicated, that's just such a way of whitewashing the fact that this was just batshit crazy. Shirley coped with her son's addiction through faith and prayer. She was convinced that Jesus would take care of her son, and eventually he would be saved. She believed what she believed, and had a deep love for Jesus, and held her through the dark passages. I never knew what traumas Shirley had survived. If I asked too many questions, she deflected. Sometimes Shirley would be mean, and she gave no grace for my curiosity. 1 or 2 beers, and she was on me for looking where I should not have been. Don't go through those drawers without permission. This is not your house. Can you imagine if your grandmother said that to you? Like, that would just be so jarring. I know it's not my house, but I thought I was welcome, Yeah, grandmother has a real drinking problem of her own. A real drinking problem. And she says that in these moments, I could sense Shirley had a story. My guess is that something in her childhood had made her feel unloved and uncared for. She and I had a complicated relationship. I'll just stop with this jargon of we had a complicated relationship. Just be honest and stop trying to be so noble about it all. We had a complicated relationship just as she had with her son, but I loved her. As time went on, it became evident that she had a complicated relationship with herself. Jada has now used the word complicated 3 times in the span of half a page. My grandmother believed that although my father's drinking and substance abuse was a problem, her heavy drinking wasn't. And Shirley was a binge drinker. Jada says so, but she didn't see herself as an alcoholic. Crazily enough, when Rob started to become sober and started attending AA meetings, the family attended one to celebrate his first anniversary of sobriety. And when given a chance to speak at the podium, Shirley said that concerning Rob's recovery, I don't know how Rob became an alcoholic. Jada says that she and her mother immediately looked at each other in disbelief. You don't know. Why don't you check the mirror, Shirley? Jada says, I think Grandmother Shirley really believed she wasn't an alcoholic because, as far as I could see, she drank only on Friday evenings and on Saturday. Never on Sunday because that was the Lord's Day. Shirley was old school in her definition of alcoholism. You drink every day, you can't hold a job, and you can't take care of your family. This definition kept her in denial. Never in her day had she ever considered the idea that there was such a thing as a functioning alcoholic. But I think the thing that would be really scary about Shirley is the way she transformed when she drank. So, there's the whole her being sharp with Jada and being like, don't look at the doors, this isn't your house, get your little grubby fingers out of here. There's that side. But then there's another side that is decidedly crazy. And not just mean and not just, some people get mean and then some people get emotional and some people get huggy. But she was like all those things and then some. Jada says Shirley could be extra huggy and kissy when she drank, or in episodes that were more frightening, she would go on long rants all by herself down in the kitchen. I could hear her shouting at an unknown antagonist for hours. Who is she talking to? Why is she so upset? I would quietly ask myself. And then there were times when she would be caught up in raucous laughter, fully entertaining herself alone. She says that when these times came, she would hide. And who among us would not dart for the nearest linen closet? She says behind a closed door upstairs in an extra bedroom where Shirley kept shoes and costume jewelry, I distracted myself by playing dress up. Downstairs, Shirley's volume kept rising as she ranted and then becoming more and more slurry and more frightening. Why was Jada with this woman? Right? Because by every measurable metric, she has somewhere else to go. She should not have been with this Shirley woman who's drinking over the entire weekend. And the thing is that for the most part, Jada was probably with the grandmother on the weekends if she was with them at all, because she went to school in the other neighborhood. So if she's living with her other grandmother, she would have during the week been with that grandmother. And then I guess grandparents got some visitation on the weekends. But that's when grandmother Shirley's hitting the bottle, And if Adrien knew that the grandmother had a drinking problem, why was she allowing her daughter to spend long visits over there? And then this is what I'm saying. Adrien is not a maternal person. She's just abdicating the role of mother to any living body that will take this child off her hands, it would appear. And it bothers me because Jade didn't ask to be brought into this world. They decided to bring her into this world. And now that she's here, what are you going to do about it? You're going to let all the grandmothers, the alcoholic grandmother, take care of her in a home where a drug-addicted and abusive father is going to be banging on the door, screaming, Mama, I'm hungry? Why was Adrien allowing Jada to be in these situations? And quite frankly, I wish Maran had pulled a couple more strings and been like, baby girl stays over here with us. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I know she probably, it's not really a possible reality for her to say that. These paternal grandparents really loved her too. So I should walk that back. Maran didn't have the authority to say that, but it would just be heartbreaking to know that you had to share custody or share visitation with this family that is going to let Jada just sort of wander off by herself to amuse herself in a closet. You're downstairs watching Wheel of Fortune, guzzling beer. I mean, it's just so incompatible with the way that a child should be loved. And if you knew this was going on, why would you allow your child to be at that house? I don't understand it. And don't come at me and say it was the 1970s and a different time. If one more person tries to tell me that because I live in this generation, I just could never have any conceivable understanding. I know people from the 1970s, y'all. It wasn't 1,000 years ago. Okay, and I'm really getting sick in the comments and being like, well, you don't know, it was a different time. Don't I though? Because I know people, my mother, my father, my aunts, my uncles, most of the adults in my life, most of the older adults that I know have given me a very clear picture, all right? Loving your children is not a new idea, okay? Now, we may conceptualize parenting in a different way, but protecting your children from dangerous situations has always been a parent's job since the dawn of time. Okay, so don't even come at me and be like, well, the 1970s was a time of more free parenting stuff. I know that. I was raised by people who were raised in the 1970s, okay? I understand. In fact, I was raised with a pretty free hand myself. That being said, don't even say, well, it was another time. There's never another time when you should be letting your child in the house with an addict. Okay. Rant over. Sometimes Grant would step in and he would put his foot down with Shirley and he would just resolutely tell her, that's enough. Or Shirley, just be quiet. Poor Grant. He never spoke about anything. A lot of times he just sat out on the porch reading his book. And he was gone a lot, running errands or, sitting out there on the porch. But whenever he could, he took Jada with him to get her away from Shirley. And this is a portion that I just feel like is really important to hear. She says, as I grew up, I spent weekends at the Pinketts, trapped upstairs. Shirley's binges began to coincide with the growing sense of isolation I felt at home with Adrien. At this time, my mother's drug use was not as apparent as Rob's, although it was there. All I knew was that there was a lot going on behind closed doors. My mother was young, and like other young people, she wanted to hang out and kick it with her friends or boyfriends. When we weren't at Marion's, there were plenty of mornings when she would sleep in really late, and I'd have to rummage in the kitchen to figure out what to eat, and sometimes find myself experimenting like a mad scientist. What if I eat my cereal with Pepsi instead of milk? You guys, I don't care how crazy Jada is. I don't like the idea of a child waking up in a house and the grown-ups are asleep and there's nobody there to take care of them. That's just jacked up, and I don't care how crazy she is now. I don't care all the things. I mean, I do care, and we're going to get there. But can we just pause the cynicism for a second to say that really sucks for that little kid. You have to wake up. Your mom's in the house, but she's too hungover or she's too high to get up and help you. Just the humanity of that child, my heart just breaks for her. And I'm really sad that there wasn't anybody to help her figure out life before things got, to where she was reacting to this kind of neglect by desperately seeking attention from boys or in negative ways by acting out. But can any one of us say that it doesn't make sense that she would act out when the people that should love her won't see her? When the people who should care for her are just leaving her to her own devices to sort of wander around and, as the adults are all acting crazy, she's just sort of meandering in and out of that, and just trying to find something that will make them see her, and so I know that we're going to get into chapters where it's just we can't stop rolling our eyes, but right now I'm not there. Right now I'm just really sad for little Jada. She says, I had a lot of time on my hands. This is when my penchant for mischief turned up as I found things I was not meant to find. Weed seeds and weed paper, what do they do? I wasn't old enough to recognize the world of an addict, but as I look back, I become a witness to how Adrien's addiction was already in play and how it created an atmosphere of loneliness for me. It's interesting that both of my parents, although their addictions presented differently at this time, were never fully available to me. When I go in search of the origins of my broken heart, it is this sense of not being a priority to the two people who gave me life that creates a fracture in my feeling of worth. That is legitimate. And I am just here to say that I stand by that statement 100%. If your parents can't be bothered to give a crap about you, how are you ever supposed to feel like you're worth something in this world? If your parents walk out on you or your parents abandon you in some way and there's nobody there to care about you, how are you supposed to develop within your sense that you have value? Because, I'm not saying, you guys know my stance. Let's not falsely praise a child and everyone gets a trophy. It's not that. It's that your parents are supposed to dedicate their lives to raising you because they brought you into this world and accepted that commitment when they did. So to just abandon you to your own devices because they can't be bothered to get up because they're so hungover, that is a sin against this child. And, again, as an adult, it's your job to you've got all your capacities and everything to work through what's happened to you in a way that is appropriate and is going to lead to actual health, not redirecting the narrative and reinterpreting morality so that you can do whatever and say it was just me on my journey. Jada gets crazy later. But little Jada has my total sympathy in this chapter. She says that Rob was an untapped treasure chest of talent and knowledge, even though he was an addict, and he was decidedly weird. She thinks he was simply a man before his time, that if he lived now, that he would have been appreciated for his genius. But then she decides to tell us about this poem that he wrote called Nobody Gets Out of Life Alive. And she said that one day he just sort of dramatically delivered this poem that he had written while they were driving somewhere. This is the poem. Nobody gets out of this life alive. You can hold on to those world possessions, those things you earn each day, and know the reason you do your due, but know what folks will say. They'll say nowhere was a good one, and mean it from their hearts, no jive. But nobody gets out of life alive. Now you can tell me what you think I mean. I know the score of the game. Make $1 million and go in bed, the end will be the same. But some of us will not listen, and others will say I lie. But nobody gets out of life alive. I don't know about that. But anyway, she says the poem went on from there. It was all captivating. She loved the title of the poem from the moment she heard it because she knew that it was true, even as a child. Okay. I'm assuming that what he means by that is that you can't take anything with you, and that everything that you think that you have gathered together in this life is, it's all for naught in the end. True enough. When Rob performed, he always came alive and he shook off whatever burdens he carried. As a child, I received the gift of a handwritten book of poetry from him, and it remains one of my favorite keepsakes today. Rob also gave me one of the most important lessons of my young life. I was 7 years old when he taught me about the power of honesty. She says that she and he had gone to a movie together. They're walking through the mall or something like that. She couldn't quite remember the context, but she remembers the conversation. She says, I felt real grown walking at my father's side because he didn't feel the need to hold my hand. That was another thing I liked about Rob, how he never related to me like an incompetent child, and he was never on some fake, I'm playing daddy now when I'm with you, when he decided to see me, and I respected that. And as they're walking along, out of the quiet, he says, listen, I'm a drug addict and a criminal. He paused for a moment. So I can't be your father. My reaction was a relieved acceptance. He wasn't telling me anything I didn't already know. I respected his honesty. Finally, an adult in my life was not afraid to lift the wool from my eyes and just be straight. Painful though it may seem, the finality of a statement never conjured the sadness you might expect. I didn't know what it was like to have a father in the first place because he hadn't been around, so I had nothing to miss. Truth can be a blessing, but I can't overlook how it can be a burden to a 7-year-old. When I saw my cousins with their dads, I might have missed having a father who could do daddy stuff with me. But I resolved early that maybe that kind of daddy love just wasn't meant for me. Right, so it's the sense of, and not in a mean way do I say this, but the sort of sense of sour grapes. Like, well, since I can't have it anyway, I didn't want it anyway. And that's the way you have to resolve pain. If at a young age, that's the only way a young mind can figure it out. That if they see something they can't have, it's too painful to ruminate on it. So I didn't want it anyway. And that's okay. It's not my thing. It's not for me. You guys need that. I don't need it. I'm okay. I'm okay over here by myself. Playing in the closet with my grandmother's trinket jewelry while she's downstairs screaming at the TV. That's the end of the chapter. But you guys, that my heart hurts for her. And I just feel like I'm interested to get to the part where she starts resolving this story for herself in a way that is completely unhelpful. But I don't believe that this beginning chapter is a lie. Of course, how can we remember all the things that happened to us when we were a kid with perfect recollection? We can't. So we do, in a sense, have to rely on the way the situation made us feel. And feelings aren't the truth, but they do, if we let them become truth. They teach us how to navigate through life if we don't have any better judgment, any better compass to go by. And it seems like whatever these feelings were that she had in her childhood, and I believe that many of them are very true and real, just led to a lot of really strange decisions later in life. One of them is evident right here in the workbook page she has for us. In this workbook page on the back, she talks about dealing with difficult memories and how we have to learn. We have to go back to that childhood part of us. And she's learned coping mechanisms and ways to meet the little child inside her that I think is bonkers. She says, I eventually learned to reclaim and honor my vulnerability. One of the ways was to buy stuffed animals and allow the kid in me to enjoy them, cry with them, sleep with them. By reacquainting myself with the tender one within, I learned the power of my vulnerability. No, I'm sorry. No. Little Jada that is locked in a closet waiting for the crazy adults to come back to reality. No, buying a stuffed animal in adulthood's not going to fix that hard. Right? That is ridiculous. Crying into the stomach of Pooh Bear is not going to help you as an adult. I'm sorry. And the power of your vulnerability, the only thing I can understand from that statement is the sense that maybe she had built up so many walls that people could not get into her. And that's why she could do things like cheat on Will and then try to act like she'd done the whole world a favor, including him. But if those walls have been built up so that she could hurt somebody like that and not be able to receive their pain because she refuses to be vulnerable, I can see why she thinks she needs to learn some vulnerability. But I don't think that buying stuffed animals going to sleep with them at night and crying on them is the ticket to ride here. So, I don't know. The next chapter is called Leaving the Garden, and it starts out with, there was a big boy who had a mouthful of crooked teeth who wouldn't leave me alone and bullied me without mercy. So that's going to be an interesting chapter. We'll get on that together. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I did, because I really didn't want to have to read an entire book that was like that prologue. So I'm here for this book. I'm enjoying it, and I hope you guys are too. I'll see you later on the next one. Bye.